What if the dead could return? Not as flesh-eating monsters, but as vengeful spirits, furious that you'd simply forgotten them? For the ancient Romans, this wasn't some horror movie plot. It was a terrifying reality. Their entire world was built around sacred rituals designed to keep the dead peacefully in the underworld, and they believed that breaking those rules had dire consequences. This wasn't just a simple, ghoulish fear of things that go bump in the night. It was a deep, societal anxiety woven into the fabric of their religion, their laws, and their family life. For the Romans, the line between the living and the dead was perilously thin, and it was a sacred, lifelong duty to maintain it. The dead weren't really gone. They were just transformed. They became powerful ancestral spirits who watched over their descendants, and they could be guardians and protectors, but only if they were remembered, only if they were honored. If they were neglected, if their rights were ignored, they could become something else entirely, restless, angry, and dangerous. This is the story of the Roman social contract with the afterlife, a story of how a civilization built on order and law lived in constant fear of the chaos that could be unleashed by a single, forgotten soul. To really get our heads around this terror, we have to start not with a battle or an emperor's decree, but with a ghost story. It's one of the oldest and most detailed supernatural accounts in Western literature, and it was recorded not by some wild-eyed mystic, but by a respected Roman magistrate and author, Pliny the Younger. His account reads like a chillingly modern tale of a haunted house, and yet every single detail reveals a deep truth about the Roman psyche. It's a story that proves their fear wasn't just superstition. It was a diagnosis of a world thrown out of balance. The story, which Pliny tells in a letter to his friend, takes place in Athens. There stood a large, grand house that had fallen on hard times. It was for sale, or even for rent, at a ridiculously low price, but no one would touch it. The house was known to be a place of profound dread, a cursed space that everyone avoided. Anyone who dared to spend the night told the same story. In the dead of night, a sound would begin deep within the house, the faint clashing of iron, like chains being dragged across a stone floor. The noise would grow louder and louder, getting closer and closer. Then, a figure would appear, a ghost in the form of an old man, thin and filthy, with a long, scraggly beard and wild hair. On his hands and feet, he wore heavy, rusted chains, and he would shake them as he moved, the sound echoing through the silent halls. The sight was enough to drive people to madness, robbing them of sleep, and, some said, even killing them from sheer terror. Eventually, the house was abandoned completely, left to its ghostly resident, with a for sale sign posted in the hopes that some stranger who didn't know its reputation might be tempted by the bargain. And that's when our hero arrives in Athens, a Stoic philosopher named Athenodorus. As a man of reason and logic, he wasn't swayed by local gossip. He saw the advertisement and was intrigued by the impossibly low price. He asked around, and of course, he was told the whole horrifying story. But instead of being scared off, Athenodorus was fascinated. He deliberately rented the house. As evening fell, he set up his post. He had a couch placed in the front of the house where the ghost was most often seen. He called for his writing tablets, a stylus, and a lamp, and then sent his servants away. He decided he would focus entirely on his work, believing that an idle mind was more likely to invent baseless fears and phantom visions. For a long time, the night was completely silent. Then he heard it, the clanking of iron, the rattling of chains. Athenodorus, being a good Stoic, didn't even look up. He just concentrated harder on his writing, even as the noise grew louder. It was moving closer. Now it was at the doorway. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He looked up and saw the ghost, exactly as it had been described. The specter stood there, staring at him. It rattled its chains, and then slowly raised a hand, beckoning to him with one finger. A lesser man would have run screaming. But Athenodorus simply made a gesture with his own hand, as if to say, "Hang on a second," and turned back to his writing. The ghost, getting impatient, shook its chains right over the philosopher's head. Now, Athenodorus looked up again, picked up his lamp, and followed. The spirit moved slowly, as if it was weighed down by its chains. It led him out into the courtyard of the house. There, on one particular spot, the ghost suddenly vanished into thin air. Athenodorus, now alone in the dark, carefully marked the spot by gathering up a small pile of leaves and grass. The next day, he went to the city magistrates and told them everything that had happened. He demanded that they dig up the spot he had marked. The officials, intrigued by the philosopher's story, agreed. They started digging, and soon enough, they found what the ghost wanted them to find: a human skeleton tangled up in the very chains that had been rattling through the house for years. The bones had just been left in the dirt, unburied and unblessed. The city gave the remains a proper, honorable public burial. The rites were performed, the spirit was finally laid to rest, and the house was cleansed. From that day on, Pliny concludes, the house was free from the ghost, which had been appeased by the ceremony. So, what does this story, told by a respectable Roman, actually tell us? It's so much more than a spooky tale. It's a blueprint for Roman spiritual anxiety. Pliny himself admits he's not sure what to believe, asking his friend if ghosts are real or just figments of our frightened imaginations. But the story he tells lays out a whole set of cultural beliefs. First, look at the ghost itself. It's not a demon or some bloodthirsty monster. It's the spirit of a person with a very specific problem. In Roman terms, this was a lemur or an umbra, a shade that couldn't find peace. It looks terrifying, sure, but that's a reflection of its suffering. Its goal isn't to cause mindless terror, it's to communicate. The entire haunting is just a desperate attempt to get what it needs. The ghost is a victim, trapped between worlds not by some evil curse, but by human neglect. And that brings us to the most crucial point, the reason for the haunting. The house is haunted because a man was left unburied. For the Romans, this was a profound religious crisis. A proper burial wasn't just about getting rid of a body. It was a sacred rite that allowed the soul to travel to the underworld and join the spirits of the ancestors, the daemons. Without those rites, a soul was lost, unable to cross the river Styx, and doomed to wander the earth, tied to the place it died. These were the souls the Romans feared most. They were restless, angry, and dangerous, not because they were evil, but because of the misery they were in. They were a kind of spiritual pollution, staining the land of the living. And finally, look at the solution. How does our brave philosopher fix everything? Not with a magic spell, not with a weapon, not with what we'd think of as an exorcism. He solves the problem by performing a civic and religious duty. He arranges for a proper burial. The second the bones are given the correct funeral rites, the spirit is pacified, and the haunting stops. This hammers home the central Roman belief. The dead have power, but they operate within a system of ritual and obligation. Their anger could be soothed, but only by the actions of the living. Pliny's story is the perfect summary of this worldview. The terror comes from neglect, and peace comes from duty. It was a powerful warning to every Roman. Your responsibility to the dead doesn't end when they die. In fact, it's only just beginning. And failing to hold up your end of the deal didn't just dishonor your family. It could literally come back to haunt you. The ghost in Athens was just a single instance of a broken contract. But this relationship between the living and the dead was part of the entire Roman world, a complex system of belief that governed daily life. This wasn't just about avoiding ghosts. It was about maintaining cosmic balance and ensuring the family line would continue. At the very heart of this system were the daemons. This is often translated as the spirits of the dead, but that doesn't really capture it. The manes were the deified souls of your ancestors. After a proper funeral, a Roman didn't just vanish or go to a faraway heaven. They were thought to transform into minor household gods, divine beings who still had a vested interest in how their living relatives were doing. Tombstones all across the Roman Empire often started with the letters diem, for dis manibus, to the deified spirits of the dead. This wasn't a sad memorial. It was a dedication, acknowledging the dead person's new divine status. This created a deep social contract. The living owed the dead remembrance, honor, and offerings. In return, the daemons were expected to act as guardians. They would watch over the family, protect the household, and maybe even offer guidance in dreams. They were like a spiritual board of directors, whose power was fueled by your memory of them. This contract was maintained through a series of incredibly important rituals. A Roman funeral, for instance, was a huge public performance. The procession would include actors wearing wax masks molded from the faces of the family's most distinguished ancestors. It was as if the entire lineage, living and dead, was marching together to welcome the newcomer. The tomb wasn't a place of dread. but an eternal home, a sacred space where families would visit and hold commemorative feasts, pouring wine and leaving food for the deceased through special tubes that led down into the grave. This wasn't weird, it was just feeding the family. The most important of these rituals was the festival of Parentalia, held for 9 days every February. This was a time for the entire city to remember its ancestors. Temples were closed, no one got married, and it was a quiet, citywide holiday for the family. Romans would go to their family tombs and leave simple offerings: flowers, grain, salt, and wine-soaked bread. It was a time to make sure the Manes were happy and would continue to protect the family for the next year. This festival was a beautiful expression of family love, but it also carried a clear warning. The poet Ovid tells a story about a time the Romans got busy with a war and forgot to celebrate Parentalia. The result was horrifying. The angry spirits of the dead supposedly surged from their tombs, howling and gibbering through the streets of the city, plaguing the living until the proper rites were quickly performed. The lesson was crystal clear. Keep your ancestors happy, because you do not want to find out what happens when they're not. So we've seen how the Romans cared for their good ancestors, the honored Manes. But what happened when that contract was broken? What about the spirits that weren't honored? The ones that died violently or were forgotten? The ones that became twisted by neglect and rage? Before we dive into the world of the truly vengeful dead, the spirits that required not honor, but exorcism, if you're finding this glimpse into the Roman mind fascinating, think about subscribing for more deep dives into the ancient world. If Parentalia was a festival of love for the good dead, then Lemuria was a ritual of fear for the bad dead, the lemurs. These were the spirits that truly terrified the Romans. A lemur was a soul that had gone wrong. These were the ghosts of those who didn't get a proper burial, who died violently, or who were simply forgotten. They were the lost and the angry. Unlike the Manes, who were tied to a specific family tomb, the lemurs were believed to be homeless, malevolent ghosts that could wander into any house and cause trouble. They were the embodiment of all Roman anxiety about spiritual neglect. The festival to deal with them, the Lemuria, took place on 3 nights in May. This was considered such an unlucky and spiritually dangerous time that all the temples were closed and no weddings were performed. The mood wasn't one of remembrance. It was one of dread and purification. The poet Ovid gives us a detailed, step-by-step guide to the ritual a homeowner had to perform to cleanse his house of these things. At midnight, the head of the household, the paterfamilias, had to get up and walk barefoot through the silent house. He had to make a special hand gesture to ward off evil, then wash his hands 3 times in pure spring water. Then came the main event. He would fill his mouth with black beans, a food strongly associated with the underworld, and spit them out one by one, without looking behind him. As he did this, he had to repeat a chant 9 times. With these beans, I redeem me and mine. The beans were an offering, a distraction for the spirits who would supposedly stop to gather them. After the 9th bean, the ritual reached its climax. The paterfamilias would clash bronze pots and pans together, making a ton of noise to scare the spirits away. Finally, he would shout a different chant, 9 times. Asterisk Manes exite paterni. Asterisk. Ghosts of my fathers, depart. Only then was the house considered pure and the family safe for another year. Every part of this ritual speaks to a deep terror. The bare feet, the black beans as a ransom, the loud noise. This was not a respectful invitation. This was a desperate, annual eviction notice served on the most dangerous squatters imaginable. This fear also meant the dead could be weaponized. The Romans practiced a form of magic using what we call curse tablets. Someone seeking revenge would scratch a curse onto a thin sheet of lead, naming their victim. They would then call upon the gods of the underworld and, crucially, on the restless spirits of the unburied or prematurely dead to carry out the curse. These tablets were then folded, stabbed with a nail, and dropped in a place considered close to the underworld, like a well or a fresh grave. The logic was chilling. Who better to inflict suffering on the living than the souls who were already suffering? They were the perfect supernatural hitmen. With all these beliefs, you might imagine every Roman lived in a state of constant paranoia. But the Roman world was complicated, and their views on the afterlife were not all the same. There was a whole spectrum of belief, from total devotion to total skepticism. The popular idea of the afterlife borrowed heavily from the Greeks. was a pretty detailed place. After death, your soul was led to the river Styx, where you had to pay the ferryman, Charon, a coin to get across. This is why a coin was often placed in the mouth of the dead. On the other side, the underworld was ruled by Pluto. It had the gloomy fields of Asphodel for the average person, the dark pit of Tartarus for the wicked, and the blissful Elysian fields for heroes. This map gave you a clear reason to live a good life and get a proper burial. No coin for Charon meant you were stuck on the riverbank, becoming one of those restless ghosts. But among the educated elite, these literal stories were often seen as fables for the common people. Philosophers offered more rational ideas. Epicureans, for example, argued the soul was made of atoms that simply dissolved at death. No afterlife, no ghosts, nothing to fear. Stoics had various ideas, with some believing the soul lived on for a while before rejoining the divine fire of the universe. So, if even influential people like Pliny had their doubts, why were these rituals so important? Why would a skeptical philosopher still bother? The answer comes down to mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. These rituals were more than just religion. They were the bedrock of Roman identity. To perform the rites was a matter of civic and family duty. To neglect them was to disrespect the entire tradition that made you Roman. Plus, these shared rituals were a powerful social glue. A common fear, and a common way to deal with it, binds a community together. The rituals around death gave people a structured way to handle grief and the anxiety of mortality. Whether a ghost was literally rattling chains in your courtyard was almost beside the point. The fear of it was real, and the rituals were the cure. As one modern scholar puts it, the Romans had a very flexible mindset. They talked about the dead being angry when bad luck and a guilty conscience made them think a ghost was getting revenge. They talked about them as protectors when they were honoring them. And at other times, they talked as if the dead were completely gone. Their belief was practical. The system was strong enough to hold both genuine terror and philosophical doubt, because its real job was to maintain order in society and in the soul. In the end, the Roman terror of the dead returning wasn't just a fear of ghosts. It was a deep, almost rational anxiety about what happens when relationships are broken, duties are forgotten, and the sacred line between living and dead is crossed. The dead weren't monsters, they were family. And keeping them happy was essential to keeping the world from falling into chaos. The whole intricate system of funerals, festivals, and household rites was the machinery that kept the Roman world running. It turned the potentially dangerous dead into helpful ancestral gods, the manes. And it gave them the tools to banish the spirits they truly feared, the lemurs, back to the shadows. It was a world held in a delicate balance by memory and obligation. To forget was to invite chaos. To neglect your duty was to risk waking the anger of those who sleep, an anger that might just show up as a rattling of chains in the dead of night. So the next time you visit a cemetery and place flowers on a grave, or just feel a pang of guilt for not having visited a loved one's resting place, remember the Romans. You're taking part in a dialogue that's thousands of years old, a conversation with the dead, built on the fundamental human need to remember and the ancient, deep-seated fear of what happens when we forget. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the Roman underworld. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the ancient world. Let us know in the comments what other ancient beliefs you'd like us to uncover next.